Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our adult forum, to our Tippy McMichael lecture series, the second part of a two-part presentation from the Reverend Nancy Frausto. I'll say a little bit more about our guest in a moment, but let me first remind those of you who are watching live on YouTube that we would love for you to navigate over to the Zoom webinar so that we can hear from you, so that you can share your questions and your comments. This always works best when there is discussion, and we depend on your participation for discussion. If you're on YouTube, we're not able to see your chat, your comments, so take a minute to follow the link that is posted there in the chat, and that will take you to a website where you can easily find the Zoom webinar link. Come and join us. We'd love to hear from you. Once you're in the Zoom webinar, remember the Q&A feature is the best way to get your comments or your questions to Nancy or to me. And don't wait until the end. If something crosses your mind that you want to share, use that Q&A feature, and I'll hold on to your comments or your questions until an appropriate time, and then I'll share them with Nancy. But again, this works so much better if we are able to share the conversation with one another. So please do use the Q&A feature here on the Zoom webinar to share your thoughts. Again, what a treat it is for me to welcome to our Tippy McMichael series, the Reverend Nancy Frausto. Nancy is the Associate Rector at San Lucas, St. Luke's Episcopal Church in Long Beach, California. She is a strong voice and a leader in our church. She reminds us of what it means to be faithful and to be the church. And she has chosen as her topic for our series, Back to the Basics. Last night, she spoke a little bit about what does it mean to be faithful as the church as we transition from the pandemic to post-pandemic time, and she's going to expand upon that this morning. Again, Nancy, we're so glad that you're with us, and I'm going to turn it over to you, and I'll be back with questions in a little bit. Thanks, Nancy.
Buenos dias, good morning. Greetings from really early in the morning in LA. I am not a morning person, so I am glad I woke up, I listened to my alarm, got up, got ready, and I'm here with all of you. I'm so happy to spend a little bit more time with you guys this morning. The conversation yesterday, we talked a little bit about what the church has been, what the church was during the pandemic, and where we are being invited to go as we are so ready for this pandemic to be over. And I kept coming back to the idea of back to basics, because I really do think, and this is the perfect time, Eastertide, this is the perfect time for us to kind of look at the disciples and see how did it all start. And really, it all starts with storytelling. It starts with us telling a story of how Jesus has transformed our lives, where we have seen God's love in our everyday life. So for today, I really do want to focus on that. You know, sometimes we use the word evangelism, and that terrifies people, especially Episcopalians. I don't know why. I think, well, okay, I do know why. But evangelism it can be a little bit terrifying because it involves us being vulnerable. But the only way that we can be the church is if we evangelize and tell the stories. Let me be clear. When I'm talking about evangelism, I don't want you to think that I need you to convert the whole world and bring them to the Episcopal Church. We don't need Episcopalians, okay? Like, we're great people. I love my Episcopal Church. But what we need is people who know and share God's love. And that could be in whatever a church, the church down the street. It doesn't have to be yours. But if we are comfortable telling our stories of pain and our stories of transformation and our stories of God's love, then we can listen to other people's stories and recognize where God is present. So I'm saying a lot of like stuff, and I'm just going to start with my own story. I'm asking all of you guys to be vulnerable. So I'm going to be a little bit vulnerable. And it's really hard when I don't see your face. So I am going to picture random people in my head as I tell my story. it's a long story, so I'm not gonna share everything. Follow me on Facebook or Twitter, and we can get to know each other through there. I can tell you my whole story there. But I have always, as long as I could remember, had a really cool relationship with God. Um, Sometimes playing around and not so playing around. I say that God and I are in non-speaking terms, and it's not about God. It's all about me. Every time there is tension in my relationship with God, I have to be honest. It's my part, right? It's not God. Um, but even as a child, as a young girl, my mom would tell me that my imaginary friends were baby Jesus and my guardian angel. So now I'm a priest, right? Wow. But when we came to the United States, if you don't know, I'm a dreamer. I'm a DACA recipient. So that means I crossed the border when I was 7. And there was a lot of stuff that happened. There was a lot of trauma and a lot of pain. And my family went through to being homeless for quite some time after we came into the United States. So whew, there's been there's been some stuff I've been working with my therapist about. But every time I look back into my childhood, I focus on the places where I knew God was there, where God never left my family and I. And I'm going to share a story about my crossing the border. Talk about being vulnerable. I was 7 years old, and I remember every detail of that night. We were told that we were only going to run for half an hour, and it actually turned out to be 8 hours. And it was up and down the hills, hiding from the helicopters, hiding from Border Patrol. And somewhere along the way, we got separated from the bigger group. And I remember being surrounded by darkness. It was so dark that night. I don't remember any stars. I don't even remember the moon. What I do remember is putting my hand in front of me and not being able to see my hand because it was so dark. When we got separated from the bigger group, it was a terrifying moment. Terrifying moment. But what I remember is that from the bushes to the side of where we were standing, a voice came out. Now, I know in my head that that was another person hiding from Border Patrol. I know that it was a man hiding under the bushes. And I know in my heart that that was also the voice of God who told us, don't give up, keep running, don't give up. That voice continues to be a part of everything I do in my life. When things get so difficult, that voice comes back and says, don't give up, keep on running. That's the voice of God. The voice of God that day, well, that night, came from a man hiding under the bushes, hiding from Border Patrol as he himself ran, chasing the idea of having a better life than what he had in his home country. God has always been present in my life, telling me, don't give up, keep on running. So it's no surprise. It's no surprise that as I turned, was it 11, 12 years old, and I was already here in the US and we have found the Episcopal Church, that I fell more in love with this God. this God that was present with me in the scariest moment of my life and said, don't give up. So a lot of people sometimes laugh when I tell this part of the story, because I was that kid on Saturday mornings that when my parents would go to work, I would wake up really, really early, not to watch cartoons, but to clean the house and get the coffee pot ready, because I knew that Jehovah's Witnesses were going to come knock on my door and they were going to talk about God. Yes, I was that kid that looked forward to receiving the Jehovah's Witness or the Mormons at my house, because we were talking about God. So in my head, we were talking about love. We were talking about this amazing presence in our lives that transforms us and leads us into living love-filled lives. Now, of course, I didn't have that language as a child. I just knew I was all in with this God story. Um, and that there was a lot of like conflicts in between there, because theologies are really different, but at the end of the day it was about God. So as I grew up and I went into ordained ministry, I've always brought that with me. I brought up this notion that let us tell our stories about where God has been in our lives, in the funny moments and in the sad painful ones too. For us as the church, as we go back into some sort of normal that can never be the same, I invite all of you to start small and start sharing your stories of faith with the people around you. Start small. Start with your family, with your best friend. They may think you're a little weird, but you're not, because I bet you that they will have stories of their own. After you get a little bit comfortable there, do it in a small group at church. Use a Sunday morning, the rector's forum time, or any time, to gather in a small group and tell your story of faith. It is a little bit scary, especially when you are on Zoom and you have no idea who's watching you and who will judge you. But this is just between you and I and like the web, because it's on YouTube. But anyway, even though it might be scary, there is joy that comes when you share how God is moving in your life or how God has moved into your life. Now, in the Episcopal Church for the last couple of years, we've been trying to bring everyone into this idea about the Episcopal way of evangelism, right? And we say it's a spiritual practice. Evangelism is a spiritual practice. It is the practice where we seek, we name and celebrate Jesus's loving presence in the stories of all people, and then invite them to more. What is more? It could be anything, but just invite people to be in this deep relationship, not with the institution, but in a deep relationship with one another and with God. So, as part of evangelism, and we need to start with evangelism, especially now, we're going back to the church, we're going back to our buildings, but we the church, it's up to us. It's up to us to tell the story. We need to tell the story about how difficult the pandemic has been, but also how God has been present with us in this pandemic. God never, ever abandons God's people. So it is our job to share that story, to tell others where we have felt that presence, where our community has been God's love, and then invite people to more. But before we can even go into the whole evangelism story, I do want to share with you that There's this amazing lay leader in our church, Dr. Sandra Montes. And Dr. Montes wrote this amazing book about becoming real and thriving in ministry. So, in order for the church to be faithful in its call to follow Jesus, it must be real. Okay? REAL. We have to get real. And we must follow these following practices that she states in her book. We have to practice being in respectful relationships. You know, yesterday I mentioned how we don't have to agree on everything, but we do have to be in relationship with one another. We have to practice being in respectful relationships. When we are in respectful relationships, we can hear each other's stories and like truly hear what the person is telling us. It's not about debate, but it's just about being present with the other person and seeing how God has moved in that person's life and celebrating that. Dr. Monta says that we have to practice excellence. Excellence is not perfection. Yesterday I mentioned the resurrection is not about perfection. Again today, when I talk about practicing excellence, it doesn't mean that we have to be perfect in the way that we do things, but we do have to strive at being better, at doing better. We have to make sure that whatever ministry we're doing, however way we are trying to engage in respectful relationships, we always strive to be better. We strive to follow the example of Jesus. Now, one of my favorite things that Dr. Montes mentions is that we have to be authentic. Ooh, I love the word authentic. And to be authentic means coming from a real place. It is when our actions and words are congruent with our feelings and our values. Dr. Montes writes, Jesus is an authentic leader and showed us how to lead authentically. Jesus knows who he is. Jesus is not concerned about popularity. He is an authentic leader who teaches by the examples we find in the Bible. You guys know that song, They'll Know We Are Christians by Our Love? I think about that song when I think about being authentic. We have to be authentic in how we present ourselves, how we present our faith, our community of faith. We have to be real. We can't pretend to be something that we are not. This doesn't mean that we never change. When we know better, we do better. But we have to be authentic in our process. We have to be real. Lastly, she says that we have to practice love. The easiest and the hardest part of all of this. We have to practice love. Loving God, loving our neighbors, and loving ourselves. So, if we take these nuggets of wisdom from Dr. Montes about becoming real, our church community will thrive. So will we. Our relationship with God will change, and our relationships with others will change because we are actively practicing in having respectful relationships, in excellence of being and doing and being better. We are authentic about who we are. And that means we are real about where our flaws are, where we have messed up, where we could have done better, but we didn't. We need to practice love. It all comes back to love. So take all of it, take everything that I just presented to you, everything that Dr. Montes has said, our definition of Episcopal evangelism. We seek, name, and celebrate Jesus's loving presence in the stories of all people and then invite everyone to more. When you bring together the practices, the spiritual practices of the spiritual practice of evangelism and the practices that Dr. Montes talks about in her book, imagine what the church could do. When you start telling your story, imagine how that story can transform and invite others to share their story. I am always in awe when I think about those first Christians who did not have Twitter or Facebook and could not post about their faith. Not that many Episcopalians do that anyway, but think about it. They didn't have the means that we have to share the story of Jesus. And the story of Jesus spread around the world, spread for generations. They did such a good job at telling that story that even after a couple of world pandemics, we find ourselves here and now, telling the story, gathering every Sunday to hear the story. They did such a good job at telling the story about this Jesus guy and this God of love that innocent 7-year-old who crossed the border, who spent years homeless, fell so deeply in love with the story that she has dedicated her life to continue spreading that story, who now finds herself talking to a mere self, but knowing that there are others who are listening, who somewhere along the way also experience God's presence, who also fell or are falling in love with this story. It is this story of all of us together following Jesus that can lead us into the practice of becoming a beloved community. Now, that's another word, that's another term that we keep hearing all over the Episcopal Church now, right? As the Episcopal branch of the Jesus movement, we dream and work to foster beloved communities. But what are beloved communities? Where all people may experience dignity and abundant life and see themselves and others as beloved children of God. That 7-year-old Nancy who heard God saying, "Don't give up, keep on running." That little girl who grew up to become a priest is inspired every day by the stories of the people in her community, in my community, in our church. Is inspired to see how people continue to work towards this idea of becoming the beloved community. Now, the truth is that we may never get there in our lifetime. But man, the beauty we can find, the blessings that will be bestowed if we start working towards it. God blesses that. God blesses as we try and fail over and over again. God never leaves us and continues to push us forward to say, keep on running, don't give up, keep on fighting for the ideas, for the notion, for the possibility of being a beloved community where all people can see the story of Jesus's loving presence in their lives and in the lives of others. Be real, be real, be authentic, be surrounded by love. Oh, wow. Can you imagine? Can you imagine how if we engage in all of these practices as we come out of this pandemic, how your church, your people, St. Paul's, how it can be a beacon of hope for the community it surrounds, for its state, for its nation? If we really want to practice being the church, we have to get real. We have to tell the stories, and we have to strive day and night and pray for the strength to continue on our journey of becoming a beloved community. We have an amazing opportunity right now. We have an amazing opportunity to drop everything that doesn't matter. You know, the pandemic gave us the opportunity. It gave us a lot of bad things, but it gave us the opportunity to strip it all down, to go back to what matters. What matters are God's people. How are we being present with God's people? Think about it. Think about everything that was stripped away because of the pandemic, and hold on to the basics. Your family, the love of your family, your faith community, the people who are in need, the people who show up day in and day out, even though they're tired. When we strip everything back to basics, we come back and we say, actually, you know what? The only thing that matters is the people, because they're God's beloved children. We matter. So what is our church doing to make sure that everybody knows that they matter? How are we spreading the good news of the resurrected Christ, who was not about the power and authority, but about the love? I know that I've gone all over the place here, and that's because even though I say, let's go back to basics and it's simple, it's not. It's really difficult to go back to basics because we get tempted to throw in all of this stuff. But if you take anything that I've said yesterday or today, take this with you. The power of stories is amazing. Start by telling your story. Be vulnerable. Tell the story where you have felt alone, where you haven't felt God's presence, and then tell the story where you have. Invite others to see that God has been there and that God will continue to be there. You know, God, I often picture God, you know, trying to write us in God's story, and we're difficult people, all of us. And sometimes we try to walk away from the story. But God always gives us an opportunity to come back into the fold, to partner in co-creating a beloved community. I am filled with, sometimes I don't even have words. You know, and obviously you could tell, but I don't have words to express how beautiful and powerful it is for a community of faith to truly commit to the practice of being the church, of being the body of Christ here and now. I hope and pray that all of you who are present, who are hearing this, who will hear this, truly commit to being the church once this pandemic's over. And now, it's not going to be over in one day to the other. It's going to take some time. We will still need to be socially distanced. We still need to wear our masks. We need to make sure people are vaccinated. But in all of that, be committed to being followers of Christ and being the church and living into the resurrection, living into the great possibilities of what can be if only all of us work together. If we are real and if we share God's love with everyone. I'm not sure there are many places, many communities of faith who really want to commit to that, though. And that makes me a little anxious and a little bit sad. And if I'm being honest, a little bit mad. Because it's really hard work. It's really hard to be followers of Christ. It's really hard to love, especially in a time with so much division. And yet we're called to do so. We are called to follow Jesus. So I'm wondering, where do y'all think Jesus is leading you now? Where is Jesus leading you in your own personal life? Where is Jesus? Where is the Spirit leading your church? I invite you to take some time and really think about this. I know that I do. I'm a little neurotic, and sometimes I stay up and I pray and I have conversations of, God, can you be a little bit more clear? Where are you leading me? Where do you want me to go? Where do you want my community of faith to go? We need to engage in that conversation with God and with each other. After we share our stories, after we work on evangelism and sharing our stories and listening to the stories of other people, after we listen to other people, we need to listen to God, to the Spirit. Where are you leading this new church into being? And we are a new church. We should be a new church. We don't go through everything that we went through in the last year and not become a new church. Even in a normal year, when there's no pandemic, when there's no social upheaval, you don't get through the whole year and not change. We need to constantly change. And I know a lot of us are terrified about change. Change is scary. Change means also that there is growth, and there are growing pains in growth. But what happens if we don't change? Then we die. We truly, truly die. If the tree's not giving any fruit, then what is the tree good for? If the church is not doing God's work, then why are we calling it church? So where do we go from here? I bring it back to the basics. Whenever you feel lost, wherever you don't know where you are going or where your church is going, go to the basics. Go back to sharing the story. I bet there are many people in your church, in the Episcopal Church actually, in all churches, who actually have not even taken the time to think about their God story. Take a moment now. What is that moment where you heard God's voice, where you felt God's presence? What is that resurrection story that keeps telling you, do not be afraid, keep running, don't give up? I guarantee you we all have it. And maybe it didn't say exactly the same thing that it said to me, but it's there. As we move into this unknown future, your church, our church, every church has the opportunity to strip away everything that doesn't matter and focus on the people, on God's beloved children, and focus on our relationship with God, with each other. It's a little terrifying and it's a lot exciting. Yesterday, I mentioned that when we do church and we do it good, it saves lives. You've heard a little bit of my story. It saved my life. And my story is one in millions. When we do church bad, it starts stripping away at the soul. It starts killing the soul. I know you can get all theological and say, no, actually, Nancy, you can't kill a soul, but trust me. There's a reason why so many people have stopped believing in church or in the institution or in God. It's because we have done church bad. Let us learn from that mistake. And let us come out of this pandemic doing and being a good church. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Nancy. I want to remind people to please share your questions or your comments using the Q&A feature, and I'll be happy to share those with Nancy. Let me start with a question of my own, if I may, while people share their questions and comments. What can the church do to encourage people to practice telling their story? Not just clergy and staff, but how can we be about the work of hearing and honoring each other's stories when so few of us get to speak when we're together, at least in a formal way? Like, what are some examples of congregations or communities that you think are good at helping people tell their story, and how do they get that done?
If you heard me last night, you're gonna say, there she goes again. Liturgy is a great place to open the floor. We need to get a little bit better in our church about, like, testimony sounds so evangelical, but in different cultures, in the Episcopal Church, is not, in the Latino culture, you give someone the opportunity to tell their God story and they will testify. And it's really hard to stop people, but we need to encourage people not to be afraid to tell their story, and we need to give them a space in our liturgy to do so, because that makes it even more sacred. One of the things that I know that in my church that we engage, again, BCP folks may not be a little bit happy that I will say this, but one of the things that we did during the summer is instead of hearing, Paul's letters to the church, we actually had our congregation write letters to the church. And we invited different people each Sunday to share their letter to their church. The places where the church has harmed them, and their hopes to the church of where we could be better. And every single one of those stories is so sacred. So we have to, because we don't have many other opportunities to do so in a way that the whole community is involved, we need to find opportunities on Sunday morning. Sunday morning is the best time to share some of these stories. And, for priests, I invite you to encourage people to be lay preachers. This does not give me any power to preach. Like, trust me, like this collar just gets really hot. But we're all preachers. We're all evangelists. We're all teachers. So let us encourage and lift up new voices.
What about with youth? Emma Mitchell, who is our youth minister, she says, "Thank you for sharing your story with us, especially such a vulnerable story from your childhood. What words would you share that could encourage children or youth of a congregation who are exploring their own identities and finding their own words for God and their relationship with God? How can they? How would you encourage them to do that with confidence? And how can they do that in a full way as a part of the whole community with adults around them as well?"
So if we want our children and our youth to do something, we have to model it. So we need to make sure that we start changing the way we do some of the conversations in church. And when the youth and children start seeing that people are sharing certain things, they will get a little bit more comfortable. Now, in my experience with children and youth, they all have the most deep theological conversations I've ever had with them, because they have not been I don't want to use converted, but they haven't been like messed up by the church yet. Oh, that sounds so bad. But if we don't actually have to do much to encourage children. What we have to do is actually just sit down and listen. If we give kids the opportunity, if we tell the story of who God is, kids will share. That has been my experience. And we have to do it in a way that is fun, but a way that in a way that it's real and that it speaks to their experience. And again, we need to definitely start by modeling it ourselves. I know that doesn't give you any practical tools. Unfortunately, I always talk about like the theory of doing things, and I don't give checklists because it's different in every place. And besides, like my I always tell people like, no, you need to give me like step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. I don't even follow them when they do give them to me. So what I invite you to do is, when you are working with children, when you are working with youth, start off by modeling the behavior yourself, but most importantly, just keeping your mouth shut and listening. Because even if they don't say words like God or Jesus or church, God, Jesus, and the church teachings are there if we are modeling it ourselves.
Thank you. One individual shares that her story is hard to tell. I think there's just some particular vulnerability there. And yet she acknowledges a real eagerness to share with others who are suffering, to know that God will show up. How do we encourage someone to trust that she has a story to tell, even if she's not able to tell it? What does that mean?
Thank you for that question, because that's such a real thing. I've shared my story a couple of times, and every time it's terrifying. Every time I get like the like my throat starts to close up and I want to cry. Because like I said, it's being vulnerable just opens you up to judgment, and the last thing you want is judgment from your faith community. When your story is difficult to share, find a small group of trusted individuals. And actually, if you haven't done so, start off by writing your story. And you don't even have to say this is my story. It could be like the story of Teresa Garcia, and you write the story, and you start getting a little bit more comfortable. And then you find that small group of people, of trusted people. Share with your clergy. Trust your clergy with that story. Say, this is confession time. This is under the stole. I'm going to tell you my story because I need to share it with someone. Your clergy then can take that story and honor it. And then you start seeing how people will honor that story. And it takes time. It takes a long time. And you might not ever be ready to share that story, but there will be other moments in your life that you could share. So I invite you to start really small. And our stories, especially our stories of pain, are so transformative to people who are going through similar things.
Stan wants to go deeply theological, and he wants to talk about the prophetic voice that you referred to yesterday. And he asks, how does that prophetic voice reflect the incarnational theology that we have, particularly in a post-pandemic time? What does what's the relationship? What's the connection between being a prophetic voice and reflecting our focus, our center on the incarnation, and particular in a post-pandemic time?
Now, why you gotta go deep theological when I'm not ready for this?
It's early.
Such a really good question. It really is. I feel like I need time to really think on that, because it really is deep. So one of the things that I will say is, all of us have the ability to be prophetic voices in this world, and the world needs prophetic voices. All of us are part of the story of how God is moving. Every single one of us is the body of Christ here and now. We are part of that incarnation. So it is our responsibility to use our voice to make sure that we are being authentic in what we believe and what we practice. So this actually may not answer the question the way that you may want, or the way that it should. I'm probably going to go back after this and write about this. So thank you. Now you're giving me another thing to think about. But how we use our voice is a huge responsibility, because it is how we are making sure that our voice is not just the voice for the voiceless, but it's the voice that says, God is here, God is present, God is love. And that in itself, that's prophetic. So I apologize that I don't have a more articulate way of answering that question, but you caught me off guard.
Thank you. I love the answer. One Susan suggests, comments with words of gratitude. She says, thank you to you, Nancy, for sharing your story and your deep soul and your passion for Episcopal evangelism, a thoughtful and thought-provoking presentation. Stan also appreciates your answer very much. He notes we are all part of the body of Christ, and the incarnation is us. And so I hear some spirit-led reflection there. Sort of maybe a parting question, which isn't fair, because it's kind of where I often feel stuck, which is how do we find the courage to invite someone into our community without feeling like we're imposing upon them? Like how do we, so often it feels like I don't want to be like one of those evangelists, right? But so say just a word about what does it mean for us to respect other people's life and story, and yet to be excited enough to invite them to come and see. What does that mean?
So one of the things that we do when we do the evangelism workshops is that we start off by showing people how to share a story, just any story, and then we say, when you go watch a really good movie, do you invite others to watch it? Or when you tried a really great restaurant, do you invite others to try it? It's that simple. So you just say yeah, hey, and be honest. It's like, oh yeah, like my church is doing this, my church is doing that, and then people might want to check it out. Sometimes you don't even have to say come to my church, but when we talk about it and we're excited about it, people are drawn to that. But I will leave one word of caution: is make sure that you really are inviting someone to a welcoming place and not a toxic place. So it starts with us looking at our church and things that might need to change in our church to truly be able to welcome someone where they will feel that excitement to be there and that love and fall in love with it like we have. So I know we don't have a lot of time, but I will leave you with that. And I invite all of you guys to check out the evangelism tools on the Episcopal Church website.
Thank you. We'll share that link to our community as well, just to remind them of that. You've invited us to really think about what it means to be the church in a post-pandemic time. We're hungry for that, and you've challenged us, you've challenged me to realize that to be faithful and to be fruitful after the pandemic is not to try to do everything that we've done before, and instead to what I heard from you that I haven't heard anywhere else is the invitation to think about how God has continued to be with us, how the pandemic has reminded us of God's abiding presence, so that we might tell that story and that good news to bring people into this wonderful, beloved community. Thank you, Nancy. Thank you. What a joy it is for me to be with you. Thank you for bringing your enthusiasm to us.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I love these 2 days.
You're welcome. Would you offer a closing prayer for our time?
Yes, let us pray.
Thank you.
Santísimo Dios, Dios de todo lenguaje, Dios de toda cultura, our loving God who comes to us in every language and every culture and every tradition. We give you thanks for this time together and for the opportunity to start thinking about how you have moved in our lives before, during, and will move in our lives after the pandemic. We ask, gracious God, for the courage to be real and to be your body in this world, and to use the blessings, to use the gifts that you have given us to make sure that we are doing our best to be that beloved community, that amazing dream that you have for all of us. Bless us and keep us, and may we love you, love each other. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Nancy. Have a great rest of your day. I know I will. Thank you so much.